So I want you to picture the interior of like a dimly lit workshop, right? Sometime in the mid-19th century.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And there's a luthier there, a craftsman whose, his entire life is basically dedicated to the preservation and creation of stringed instruments. And he has this pristine 17th century Cremonese masterpiece resting on his bench.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's a tenor viola crafted by the legendary Guarneri family. And this thing, it has survived wars, it has survived the devastating plagues of Italy, centuries of shifting musical tastes. And what does this 19th century craftsman do?
Don't tell me.
He reaches for a saw.
Oh, no.
Yeah. He meticulously, violently cuts into the centuries-old maple and spruce, just hacking away massive sections of the wood, literally physically shrinking the instrument. He discards the original carved scroll and then glues the butchered pieces back together. He took a literal saw to a masterpiece simply because it no longer fit the aesthetic of his era.
It is a genuinely horrifying image for any modern musician to contemplate.
Oh.
Or historian, really. You are describing the deliberate mutilation of an irreplaceable artifact.
Right. It feels like a crime.
It really does. But, the crazy thing is, it wasn't an act of malice in the eyes of that 19th century luthier. He wasn't destroying a masterpiece at all. He was saving it.
Saving it by cutting it in half.
Exactly, because he was saving it from the one fate that was considered, worse than destruction back then, which is being completely unplayable.
Wow. And that brutal pragmatism, that sets the stage perfectly for what we are unraveling today. Because we usually think of musical history as this triumphant, steady march of progress, right? We assume luthiers started with a primitive wooden box, and slowly, century by century, they refined the arching, perfected the varnish, and just walked a straight upward path to acoustic perfection.
Right, the evolutionary ladder myth.
Exactly. But when you look at the Baroque string family, that evolutionary ladder is completely shattered. There are massive gaps. There are bizarre dead ends. And for one instrument in particular, the historical record is just an absolute battlefield.
Yeah, you were talking about a period in history that completely defies our modern expectations of supply and demand.
Yeah.
And of artistic progression, really. It is a historical bottleneck so severe that it permanently altered the physical reality of the musical world.
So for those of you listening, especially the students, the teachers, the performers tuning in from the Viola Studio community, this deep dive is going to fundamentally change how you look at the instrument sitting in your case right now.
It really will.
We are pulling our insights from one of the most comprehensive sources ever compiled on this subject, which is Chapter 3 of Maurice W. Riley's definitive work, The History of the Viola, Volume 1. And our mission today is to explore one of the most baffling paradoxes in music history.
The Dark Age.
Right. The 17th and early 18th centuries in Italy were the undisputed golden age of string instrument making. Cremona, Brescia, Venice. These cities were producing the greatest violins and cellos the world has ever seen. Yet, simultaneously, it was an absolute dark age for the viola. The greatest luthiers to ever walk the earth almost entirely ceased production of violas.
It's just wild to think about.
We are going to find out why, and we are going to explore how that dark age actually dictates the size of your instrument, the physical pain in your left shoulder, and the repertoire on your music stand today. Okay, let's unpack this.
Welcome to Viola Studio. We are a YouTube channel dedicated to the technical, pedagogical, and artistic development of viola students and instrumentalists. In every episode, our goal is to provide a concise and entertaining analysis. We will explore key themes, the messages of the great masters, and the historical context that shaped the sound of our instrument. Whether you are taking your first steps in the alto clef, or you are a professional seeking a new perspective, there is something for everyone at Viola Studio.
Don't miss our upcoming episodes, and remember,
there's always time to explore the history and the heart of classical music.
So, to understand the sheer scale of this paradox, we first have to ground ourselves in the reality of 17th century Cremona. This wasn't just a city that happened to make instruments. It was the Silicon Valley of acoustic technology.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, you had workshops run by families whose names now command, tens of millions of dollars at auction. The Amatis, the Guarneris, the Stradivaris, the Berganzis, these were heavily guarded family businesses. They were essentially acoustic laboratories passing down the secrets of plate tuning and varnish recipes from father to son.
And they were turning out lutes, the older viols, and increasingly the new violin family, right? The demand for violins, cellos, and basses was surging across Europe. The workshops were operating at maximum capacity. But amidst all this booming economic activity, the orders for the violists simply vanished.
Just gone.
It wasn't a slow decline, it was a cliff. And Riley's research isolates two massive musical shifts that effectively killed the viola market. The first is a fundamental change in the DNA of Western musical harmony.
Right. And to understand this, you have to look at what came before. Prior to the early 1600s, a massive amount of ensemble and chamber music was constructed using five-part harmony. If you look at the choral traditions and early string consort music of the Renaissance, 5 voices were standard.
Okay, so 5 distinct lines of music.
Exactly. When you translate a 5-part texture to a string ensemble, you have your treble voice up high in the violin, your bass voice down low in the cello or gamba, and in the middle you have this vast sonic real estate. To fill that middle register, composers relied on 2 inner voices. You had a viola first and a viola the second.
Which makes perfect acoustic sense, right? Because the human ear is incredibly sensitive to the middle frequencies. It's where the human voice sits.
Yeah.
So having 2 robust viola lines weaving around each other creates this incredibly rich, dense, chocolatey texture in the center of the harmony. It provided absolute job security for the violists of the era. You always needed 2 of them to make the ensemble work.
But, musical tastes are rarely static. As we move deeper into the 17th century, composers began heavily favoring 4-part harmony.
And this is a huge shift.
Massive. This wasn't just an arbitrary choice to save ink on the page either. It was a fundamental shift toward the modern tonal system, the dominant to tonic relationships we recognize today. 4-part harmony, using a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass structure, it's mathematically highly efficient.
Efficient how? Like musically?
Yeah, it provides all the necessary voices to outline a complete major or minor chord, complete with a leading tone and a strong bass root, but without the voice crossing and dense muddiness that can sometimes occur in 5-part writing.
So it's an aesthetic streamlining. Composers wanted clarity, they wanted the melody to shine, and they wanted a strong, driving bass line.
Right.
But the collateral damage of this quote-unquote efficient new harmony was devastating. By shifting from 5 parts to 4, they instantly eliminated one of those inner voices. Overnight, half of the viola chairs in every ensemble, every court orchestra, every church band were rendered entirely obsolete.
It was an acoustic downsizing of massive proportions.
It's like an entire corporate department getting laid off because of a new software update.
That is exactly what it was. You suddenly had a surplus of highly trained viola players competing for exactly half the available work. And the economics of that are brutal. If a player cannot secure a patron or a church gig because the orchestration no longer requires them, that player is certainly not walking into an expensive Cremonese workshop to commission a new instrument.
Right. But dropping to 1 chair in the orchestra is really only half the tragedy here. Because the viola wasn't just downsized in large ensembles, it was completely locked out of the most important musical phenomenon of the entire Baroque era.
Yes, you are referring to the Trio Sonata.
The Trio Sonata. If you want to understand the 17th century, you have to understand this format. Riley notes that this form originated in northern Italy around Venice, Brescia, and Milano with pioneers like Bianchieri and Marini. But it truly exploded in Rome in the 1680s.
Largely due to Arcangelo Corelli.
Yes, Corelli. He published 48 trio sonatas between 1681 and 1694. These pieces basically went viral. They were the absolute gold standard, copied by composers in Germany, France, England. The trio sonata was the rock band format of the Baroque era. If you were a composer, you proved your worth by writing them. If you were a wealthy aristocrat, you had musicians playing them in your salon every single evening.
And we need to clarify what the word trio actually meant in this context, because it's slightly deceptive.
Oh, right, yeah.
A trio sonata was not played by 3 people. The trio refers to the 3 written melodic lines, 2 treble voices and 1 bass voice.
Right. The actual performance usually involved 4 or sometimes even 5 musicians. So what was the standard lineup for this?
The 2 treble lines were almost universally assigned to 2 violins, though you occasionally saw flutes or oboes.
Oh.
The bass line was the domain of the basso continuo. This is a crucial concept. The continuo wasn't just a single instrument, it was a functional rhythm section.
Like a jazz rhythm section, almost.
Very much so. You would have a keyboard instrument like a harpsichord or a small chamber organ playing the bass notes and improvising chords based on numeric shorthand written into the staff.
Right.
And to give that bass line punch and sustain, a melodic bass instrument, a cello, a viola da gamba, or a bassoon, would double the harpsichord's left hand.
Okay, so 2 violins on top, a harpsichord, and a cello on the bottom. The high frequencies are glittering, the low frequencies are driving the rhythm, and the middle register, the entire sonic space where the viola lives,
Is completely empty.
completely empty.
Riley's text is unambiguous on this point. The instruction for basso continuo did not imply or even allow for the inclusion of the viola. In larger orchestral scores, the viola might occasionally be used to double the bass line or fill out a chord. But in the Trio Sonata, the defining chamber music of the century, the viola was strictly, entirely excluded.
So imagine the psychological and economic impact on the viola community at this time. The most cutting-edge popular music in Europe, the music that publishers are printing by the thousands, the music that guarantees you a steady paycheck in any royal court, literally has 0 parts for your instrument.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the compounding effect on the instrument's development was catastrophic. We're looking at a vicious cycle of obsolescence here. Composers ignore the viola because it doesn't fit the new 4-part or trio sonata aesthetic.
Right.
Because composers aren't writing for it, virtuoso players abandon the viola to play the violin, where they can actually get hired and gain fame. Because there are no virtuosos pushing the boundaries of viola technique, composers see the instrument as a blunt, clumsy tool, suitable only for the least talented player in the room to scrape out basic harmonies.
Which means absolutely no one is buying new violas. Why would a master luthier like Nicolò Amati spend weeks of highly skilled labor and use his most expensive, perfectly aged tone woods to build a viola that will just sit unsold in his shop for a decade?
He wouldn't.
Exactly, he wouldn't. He'd build another violin because he probably had a wait list of 50 wealthy violinists begging for one.
This specific exclusion severely retarded the viola's progress. While the violin was enjoying a massive explosion of solo repertoire, with early virtuosi like Marini and Farina writing incredibly complex, flashy music that forced luthiers to refine the violin's setup for faster playing, the viola was basically trapped in amber.
Wow.
Furthermore, the cello was also thriving. Because the cello was a required member of that Trio Sonata Continua section, cellists were constantly employed. They were in the room with the great composers. That exposure led Domenico Gabrieli to start writing solo sonatas and re cercari for the cello as early as the 1680s. The cello was being elevated to a solo voice. The viola was left to rot in the shadows.
It's a tragic economic reality. But the historical plot actually gets much darker. Because the evolution of string instruments wasn't just shaped by musical trends and sheet music sales. It was shaped by a profound human catastrophe. Let's look at the events that forced a massive bottleneck in the luthier world. I'm talking about survival, plagues, and the rise of the Guarneri family.
You cannot separate the acoustic history of Cremona from the year 1630. If you study the demographic records of northern Italy during that time, you find a society completely brought to its knees.
Yeah, the text mentions a deadly plague sweeping through Cremona. I want to spend a moment on this because it's so easy to gloss over the word plague as just a historical footnote. We are talking about the bubonic plague.
Precisely. This was a resurgence of the Black Death, likely brought into northern Italy by troop movements during the 30 Years' War. It hit the densely packed artisan cities with unimaginable ferocity. Cremona was quarantined. Trade stopped. The streets were filled with the dead. Over the course of the outbreak, approximately half the population of Cremona was wiped out.
Half the city gone. And the plague did not spare the wealthy or the skilled. The Amati family, who were essentially the undisputed kings of string instrument making at the time, were devastated.
The records show that Girolamo Amati, the patriarch of the famous Brothers Amati partnership, succumbed to the plague. Tragically, his wife and 2 of his daughters also perished. The Amati workshop, which held the collective acoustic knowledge of generations, was practically hollowed out overnight.
But one vital link to the past survived. Girolamo's son, Nicolò Amati.
Yes, Nicolò emerged from the plague of 1630 as the sole surviving heir to the Amati legacy. He is suddenly the head of the most famous instrument-making atelier in Europe, operating in a traumatized, half-empty city.
And here is where the economics really clash with the tragedy, because the plague didn't stop the demand for violins in the rest of Europe. If anything, as courts recovered, the demand accelerated. So Nicolò Amati was drowning in orders for violins. He had the family secrets, he had the wood, but he did not have the manpower. The traditional family-only guild system just couldn't scale up fast enough.
Right, to meet this immense pressure, Nicolò was forced to break tradition. He began accepting far more apprentices from outside his immediate family than was customary. He just needed hands in the workshop.
And because of that desperate need, he inadvertently created the greatest incubator of luthier talent in human history. The roster of teenagers that walked into his shop to sweep floors and carve blocks is unbelievable.
It reads like a mythological pantheon. He trained his own son, Girolamo II. He trained Francesco Ruggieri and Giovanni Ruggieri, who would both become masters. And, crucially, he took on 2 young apprentices whose names would eventually eclipse even the Amati legacy, Andrea Guarneri and Antonio Stradivari.
If the plague hadn't forced Nicolò Amati to open his doors, the Guarneri and Stradivari instruments we revere today might never have existed. They might have been, I don't know, carpenters or bakers.
Very true.
And what is so vital to our deep dive today is that both Guarneri and Stradivari, after absorbing the Amati secrets and setting up their own shops, actually attempted to make violas, despite the terrifying lack of demand we just discussed.
Andrea Guarneri is a particularly fascinating study here. He spent years in the Amati shop, apprenticing from roughly 1638 to 1645, and then stayed on as a highly skilled master craftsman for almost another decade, until 1654. He knew the Amati proportions perfectly. When he left to start his own dynasty, his early violins were almost indistinguishable from Amati's work.
But he wasn't just a copyist, right? The famous violin experts, the Hill brothers of London, they spent their lives analyzing these instruments, and they noted that Andrea Guarneri made 2 massive progressive leaps forward from his master. He redesigned the cello to have smaller, more manageable proportions. But more importantly for us, he completely reconceptualized the viola. He conceived of a smaller size model.
To understand why this is a massive historical pivot, we have to look at what existed before him. Before 1660, makers like Gaspar da Salo, Maggini, and the early Amatis were primarily building what we call the tenor viola. These were gigantic instruments. We're talking about body lengths of 17 or even 18 inches.
Just huge.
Yeah, they were designed to resonate deeply in a 5-part harmony structure, often played resting against the chest or hanging on a strap, rather than tucked strictly under the chin.
Right, because if you try to put an 18-inch piece of wood under your chin and reach your left hand all the way to the end of the fingerboard, your shoulder is going to dislocate.
It's physically punishing.
The sheer ergonomics of the tenor viola made it impossible to play fast, virtuosic passages.
Exactly. So as musical demands slowly began requiring a bit more agility, and as the viola parts were increasingly relegated to simpler, less prominent roles, the massive tenors became a liability. Andrea Guarneri recognized this. Between 1660 and 1700, he championed a smaller model, and he dialed in a very specific dimension.
The Hills documented 3 specific Andrea Guarneri violas that survive today, made in 1676, 1690, and 1697. And they all hovered around a remarkably consistent body length, roughly 41.3 centimeters or 16¼ inches.
For any modern violist listening, 16¼ inches is the golden mean. It is large enough to provide the internal air volume necessary for a rich, booming C string, but small enough that a player of average height can navigate the entire fingerboard without suffering chronic tendinitis. Andrea Guarneri essentially established the ergonomic standard for the modern professional viola.
But because of the dead market, he made incredibly few of them, which makes the ones that did survive practically sacred objects. I really want to focus intensely on one of these. The 1697 Guarneri.
Ah, yes. Historically catalogued as the Lord Harrington, but universally revered by musicians today as the Primrose Guarneri.
Yes. The legendary Scottish violist William Primrose bought it in 1955, and the provenance of this instrument reads like a spy novel. It bounced around royal collections in the 19th century, went through the Christie's auction house in 1872, ended up with a collector in Chile, and finally made its way to the dealer Rembert Wurlitzer, who sold it to Primrose.
Primrose, who had one of the most discerning ears in the 20th century, wrote extensively in his autobiography about its flawless, even tonal quality across all strings. But beyond its sound, the physical construction of the Primrose Guarneri reveals a staggering amount about how Andrea Guarneri thought about acoustic physics and raw materials.
Let's get into the mechanics of this, because I know our Viola Studio listeners want the deep specifications. How exactly is this masterpiece built?
The back of the Primrose Guarneri is formed from a single piece of maple. But here is the critical detail. It is cut on the slab. This means the wood was sliced parallel to the growth rings of the tree, rather than across them. This gives the wood incredibly prominent, swirling visual markings, what we call the flame. And it also features small, fascinating knot formations in the upper bouts.
But the most shocking detail in Riley's text isn't the cut of the wood. It's what Guarneri did to the edges of it. There is an original added wing of wood at each upper and lower flank. I want to stop and push back on this because this sounds completely counterintuitive to everything we are taught about acoustic purity. You are saying he took a beautiful piece of slab-cut maple, realized it physically wasn't wide enough to form the full template of his 16¼ inch design, and instead of throwing it out and getting a wider piece of wood, he just glued extra strips of wood onto the sides?
That is exactly what he did.
Doesn't splicing wood together interrupt the acoustic vibrations? Doesn't the glue line act like a barrier that kills the resonance?
That is the exact logical assumption most people make. We assume a monolithic, single piece of wood vibrating uniformly is the only way to achieve perfection. But Andrea Guarneri was operating on a level of acoustic understanding that borders on alchemy. He didn't glue those wings on just to save money on wood.
Right.
He did it because he had likely tapped that specific piece of maple, listening to its resonant frequency, feeling its specific density and flexibility, and realized its acoustic properties were absolutely supreme.
So the acoustic potential of that specific log of maple was so high, it was worth the extreme difficulty of perfectly splicing extensions onto it.
Precisely. And a master luthier can create a splice so tight, so perfectly matched in cellular grain direction, using hot hide glue, which dries crystalline and glass hard, that the acoustic wave passes through the seam almost as if it were a single piece of wood. It is a testament to his reverence for the material. The top plate is 2 pieces of spruce with broad grain at the center that narrows toward the edges. It has the original quarter-cut maple scroll, and it is covered in this breathtaking golden-orange varnish.
It is a triumph of design. Interestingly, the text notes that the Hill brothers believed this 1697 instrument might have been largely constructed by Andrea's son, Giuseppe, known as Joseph Guarnerius Filius Andrea. Giuseppe was collaborating heavily with his father right before Andrea died in 1698.
It's highly probable. But what's tragic is that after Andrea died, the viola production in the Guarneri family essentially hit a brick wall. The demand was so virtually non-existent that neither Giuseppe nor his brother Pietro of Mantua were thought to have made any violas after that point.
None at all.
Right. Even the next generation, the legendary Guarneri del Gesù, whose violins are fiercely preferred over Stradivarius by many modern soloists, made 0 violas. The market was completely dead.
But here is where historical research provides a massive twist. For decades, the Hills and other experts stated definitively that Pietro of Mantua never made a viola. But in 1931, a new instrument surfaced that shattered that assumption. And this leads us to one of the most violent, fascinating stories in the entire chapter, the saga of the Frankenstein tenor.
Oh, this story. You were referring to the instrument famously played by the artist violist Paul Doctor.
Yes. Paul Doctor played a viola officially attributed to Pietro Giovanni Guarneri of Mantua. But the physical object he played had endured an absolute nightmare of historical revisionism.
It is a stark reminder that these instruments were not always treated as sacred museum pieces. They were tools. And when a tool no longer serves its function, it gets modified. According to the exhaustive analysis by the Australian luthier Lloyd Adams, who intimately restored the instrument, it was originally built in the late 17th century as a massive, true tenor viola. We are talking about a body length of over 43.2 centimeters.
That is over 17 inches, a massive sound box.
But as we discussed, as we moved into the 18th and 19th centuries, repertoire demanded shifting into higher positions, faster string crossings, and more agility. A 17-plus-inch tenor became viewed not as a resonant powerhouse, but as a clumsy, unplayable dinosaur.
So sometime in the 19th century, some unknown luthier got their hands on this irreplaceable Pietro Guarneri tenor, and they decided to modernize it.
By subjecting it to the most invasive surgery imaginable, they literally cut it down.
I need us to really visualize the sheer audacity of this. They didn't just shave the edges, they disassembled the instrument. They took a saw to the top and bottom plates, physically removing inches of aged, resonant spruce and maple from the center seams or the outer bouts.
It's hard to even think about.
It gets worse. They aggressively bent the ribs to fit a new, much smaller outline. They discarded the original carved scroll entirely and slapped a generic head on it. They hacked a 17-inch masterpiece down to a tiny, pinched, less than 16-inch husk.
It was acoustic butchery. To them, an unplayable masterpiece was worthless, so they forced it into a smaller shape to make it sellable. And in the process, they destroyed the mathematical geometry of the arching, they choked the air volume, and they ruined the aesthetic proportions. To add insult to injury, a fraudulent label was slapped inside reading Giovanni Gabrieli, Milano, 1685, which, as Paul Doctor pointed out, is patently absurd because Gabrieli would have been a 15-year-old child in 1685.
It's the equivalent of taking a pair of scissors to a Rembrandt painting to make it fit a cheap frame you bought at a yard sale and then signing a different artist's name on it. It's sickening.
But the story has a redemption arc that is equally mind-bending. Decades later, this butchered, mislabeled instrument was purchased by Professor Richard Goldner. He realized the inherent quality of the wood and the remaining varnish, and he made an incredibly bold decision. He decided the viola needed to be restored, not just repaired, but physically expanded back toward its original acoustically viable dimensions.
He brought it to the master luthier Lloyd Adams in Australia. And the details of this restoration process are staggering. This wasn't a quick glue job. It took over 2 years of grueling, microscopic labor.
Adams had to act as both a surgeon and an architect. He wanted to expand the body length back up to a resonant 41.3 centimeters, that's 16.25-inch ideal. To do this, he had to source new, highly specific wood that perfectly matched the cellular grain width and density of the original 17th century plates.
He had to graft new wings onto the upper and lower bouts, physically widening the instrument. He had to lengthen the top and bottom plates, and he had to duplicate the original reddish-brown varnish so perfectly that the naked eye couldn't tell where the 17th century wood ended and the 20th century wood began.
But the most brilliant part of Adams' restoration wasn't cosmetic, it was structural. When you piece together an instrument like a jigsaw puzzle, you're introducing massive structural vulnerability.
Why, I am completely stuck on the physics of this. A viola string setup exerts roughly 50 to 60 pounds of constant shear downward pressure on the bridge, which translates to massive compression forces on the top plate and tension forces on the back. If you have glued extensions onto the middle of the instrument, how does the entire thing not just explosively fold in on itself the moment you tune the C string up to pitch?
Because of a tiny, invisible stroke of engineering genius. Adams understood how load distribution works across the arching of the wood. To ensure all those new glued extensions wouldn't buckle under the immense string tension, he inlaid a piece of slender, oval-shaped wood directly into the center of the viola, located exactly between the base of the neck and the wooden button on the back plate.
How big was this piece of wood?
5 by 9 millimeters.
Wait, really? That is smaller than a fingernail. How does a piece of wood that tiny stop the instrument from collapsing?
It acts as a structural keystone at the most critical fulcrum point of the instrument. The neck of a viola acts like a massive lever pulling forward under string tension. The button on the back plate takes the brunt of that pulling force. By inserting that incredibly dense, perfectly fitted 5 by 9 millimeter oval right at that stress nexus, Adams locked the neck block to the back plate with immense rigidity. It absorbed the shear stress, allowing the rest of the spliced, glued plates to vibrate freely without bearing the load of the string tension. It protected the physical shape of the body without dampening the acoustic resonance.
It is absolute wizardry. And when Paul Dockster saw the restored instrument, he bought it immediately. He later had another luthier, Joseph Seton, widen the ribs slightly in 1960 to give the internal air cavity even more volume. So this single piece of wood went from a giant 17th century tenor to a hacked-down 15-inch fraud to a beautifully restored, surgically expanded concert instrument. It embodies the trauma and the resilience of the viola as a species.
Which serves as a perfect transition to the one luthier whose name is synonymous with absolute perfection, yet whose relationship with the viola is defined by extreme scarcity.
Yes, we have to talk about Antonio Stradivari, because if an Andrea Guarneri viola is a rare treasure, a Stradivarius viola is essentially a mythological artifact. Let me hit you with a sheer statistical reality from Riley's text. Antonio Stradivari lived an incredibly long, highly productive life. He worked into his 90s, passing away in 1737. Across that lifetime, he produced roughly 1,100 instruments that survive today.
Do you know how many of those surviving instruments are violas?
The number is so low, it almost seems like a clerical error.
18. Herbert Goodkind's monumental exhaustive treatise on Stradivari lists only 18 surviving violas. 18 out of 1,100. That is a mere 1.6% of his surviving output.
That ridiculously low figure corresponds perfectly with our earlier discussion about the musical Dark Age. The Trio Sonata and 4-part harmony had killed the demand. Stradivari was a businessman. He ran a busy, profitable workshop. He was not going to waste his most exquisite, heavily flamed maple and his most deeply tap-tuned spruce on an instrument no one was asking for. The Hill brothers noted that Stradivari, and indeed most luthiers of that era, probably only constructed violas on special commission or as part of a prearranged guaranteed sale. You did not just walk into Stradivari's shop in Cremona and pick a viola off the wall.
And because of that extreme historical scarcity, The laws of supply and demand have created a bizarre economic reality today. The source text quotes Deborah Rankin, a business reporter for the New York Times, discussing the astronomical prices of these instruments. She interviewed Graham W. H. Wells, who was the head of the Sotheby Musical Instrument Department in London.
His quote perfectly encapsulates the madness. He said, Strad violas are like absolute gold dust. A really fine Strad viola is worth a great deal more than its equivalent in a violin.
Gold dust. Because there are over 600 surviving Stradivari violins. A wealthy soloist or a syndicate can, with enough money, acquire one. But a Stradivari viola, there are only 18, many are locked permanently in museums or foundations. They command a premium that shatters the ceiling of the violin market.
And one of the most famous of these prearranged commissions gives us a rare, highly documented glimpse of the Baroque viola actually being celebrated. I am talking about the 1690 Medici Commission.
This is a beautiful piece of documented history. Stradivari received a massive, highly lucrative order to build a complete set of instruments for the Medici family in Florence, the grandest patrons of the arts in Italy. The order was orchestrated by a nobleman named Marquis Bartolomeo Arreberti.
And the Marquis writes this letter to Stradivari in September 1690 that is just overflowing with ecstasy. He says, I have presented the Prince of Tuscany with the 2 violins and the cello just 3 days ago, and I can assure you that he has been so pleased with them. I beg you to begin as soon as possible the manufacture of 2 violas, a tenore, and a contralto. They are needed to complete the consort.
We need to unpack the terminology in that letter to complete the consort. This implies that the Medici court was still performing music written in that older, dense 5-part harmony structure we discussed earlier. They needed the full sonic spectrum. And to achieve that, they specifically requested 2 distinct sizes of viola. A tenore, which is a large viola for the lower inner voice, and a contralto, a smaller viola for the higher inner voice.
And Stradivari delivered. The paper templates he used for these exact instruments still exist in the Stradivari archives in Cremona, dated October 4, 1690. But I want to focus intensely on the tenore from this commission. It is famously known as the Tuscan Tenore, and it sits today in a glass case in the Museo del Conservatorio di Musica Luigi Cherubini in Florence.
To call it a viola is almost an understatement. It is a leviathan.
The dimensions are physically intimidating. The body length is 47.8 centimeters. That is 18 and 1,316 inches.
For context, a modern full-size violin is 14 inches. A standard large modern viola is 16.5 inches.
Yeah.
This is almost 19 inches long.
Imagine trying to hold a 19-inch piece of wood under your chin horizontally while navigating complex fingerings. The weight, the lever action pulling on your neck, is practically an ergonomic weapon. But the visual and acoustic descriptions of it are otherworldly. Lito Bergagna, a historian who analyzed it in 1911, wrote about it with genuine reverence. He called it a stupendous instrument, noting that its exaggerated, massive shape gives it a special majesty, but it was the finish that truly captivated him.
He wrote that the yellow-golden varnish shines and gleams with lights, which seem as though they are springing out of a living being.
Springing out of a living being. We have to talk about Cremonese varnish for a second, because this isn't just hyperbole. How does wood look like it's alive?
It comes down to optical depth and refractive indices. Modern mass-produced instruments often use thick, opaque polyurethane varnishes that sit on top of the wood like a plastic shell. It kills the vibration and looks flat. But the classical Cremonese makers like Stradivari use an incredibly complex multi-layered system. First, they applied a ground coat, a mineral-rich, highly penetrative layer that sealed the bare wood and hardened the fibers, often containing silica or ash. This ground coat is highly reflective.
It acts like a mirror on the surface of the wood.
Exactly. Then, over that mirror, they layered an incredibly thin, transparent oil varnish, heavily pigmented with natural resins and dyes madder root, cochineal, dragon's blood. Because the colored oil is transparent, light passes through it, hits the reflective ground coat, and bounces back into the viewer's eye.
That's fascinating.
It creates a phenomenon called dichroism. As you tilt the instrument, the grain of the maple seems to shift, ripple, and ignite from within. It creates a three-dimensional depth that literally makes the wood look like a living, breathing entity.
And it isn't just a museum piece to look at. The faculty at the conservatory in Florence still string it up and play it occasionally for special concerts. Paul Doctor, the man who owned the Frankenstein Tenor, was actually given the honor of playing this massive 18.8-inch Tuscan Tenor in 1954 for a concert of Vivaldi and Locatelli. The resonance of a nearly 19-inch Stradivarius soundbox pushing air must be a physical force in the room.
It would have a fundamental resonance on the C string that rivals a cello. But not all of Stradivari's 18 violas were these monstrous tenors. As the demands changed, he also built smaller, incredibly innovative models. The text highlights a very famous one, the 1734 Gibson Strad.
Named for George Gibson, the prominent English violist of the Joachim Quartet, and later played by our friend William Primrose. But the Gibson Strad has a physical trait that is incredibly rare. It is perhaps the only Stradivari viola where the back is constructed from wood cut on the slab rather than quarter sawn.
This is a massive acoustic decision by Stradivari, especially considering he made it in 1734 when he was 90 years old. He was still experimenting.
Okay, I need an acoustic physics translation here. What does slicing the tree differently actually do to the sound? Let's say I'm looking at a log of maple. How does cutting it on the slab versus quarter sawn change what the player hears?
Think about the physical structure of a tree. A tree grows in concentric rings year by year. These rings represent dense, hard winter growth and softer summer growth. If you take a saw and cut directly across the center of the log, bisecting all those rings like slicing a pie into wedges, you get quarter sawn wood.
So the grain lines run perfectly straight, parallel up and down the piece of wood.
Right. And structurally, quarter sawn wood is incredibly stiff and stable because those hard winter rings act like microscopic steel I-beams running vertically through the plate. It produces a very fast, bright, highly projecting acoustic response. But if you cut the wood on the slab, meaning you slice parallel to the outside of the log, essentially shaving planks off the side you are cutting through the rings at shallow angles.
Like slicing an onion across the top instead of through the root, you get those wide, sweeping, irregular circular patterns.
Visually, slab-cut maple produces an incredibly wide, chaotic, gorgeous flame pattern. But acoustically, it is fundamentally different. Because it lacks those vertical I-beams of the quarter-sawn rings, slab-cut wood is significantly more flexible across its width. It vibrates differently. It absorbs some of the higher, harsher overtones and typically yields a darker, bradder, more complex tonal palette. It is structurally riskier, but tonally it can be incredibly lush. The fact that a 90-year-old Stradivari chose this specific cut for the Gibson viola shows he was consciously designing a darker, deeper sonic profile for the instrument.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And the legacy of these 18 instruments extends far beyond their wood. They actively shaped the course of music history. Let's look at the 1731 Stradivari Viola.
Paganini Strad.
Nicolò Paganini, the ultimate, almost demonic violin virtuoso of the 19th century. He acquires this Stradivari viola, made when Stradivari was 86. Paganini is so completely seduced by the massive, roaring tone of this specific instrument that it inspires him to do something highly unusual. He approaches the great French composer Hector Berlioz and commissions him to write a concerto explicitly for this viola.
This is a monumental moment. Paganini, using his immense wealth and fame to force a major composer to treat the viola as a solo instrument, and Berlioz delivers brilliantly. He composes Harold in Italy, a massive, sweeping, programmatic symphony featuring the viola as a melancholic, wandering hero. It is one of the pillars of the Romantic viola repertoire.
But the irony is almost painful. Berlioz finishes the score, he sends it to Paganini. Paganini opens it up, expecting a vehicle for his own massive ego, expecting continuous, blistering 16th notes, double harmonics, left-hand pizzicato. Instead, he sees a piece where the viola frequently pauses to let the orchestra play, where the viola line is introspective and lyrical.
And Paganini flat out rejects it. He refuses to play the premiere. He commissioned a masterpiece that elevated the viola, and then he ghosted Berlioz because the music wasn't flashy enough to showcase his virtuosity.
It is the ultimate virtuoso temper tantrum. But the instrument itself, the 1731 Strad, survived Paganini's ego and is now famously part of the Paganini quartet of Stradivari instruments.
So we have Andrea Guarneri creating the ergonomic blueprint, and Stradivari creating 18 untouchable masterpieces. But what about everyone else in Italy? This brings us to a phenomenon that completely redefines the market. As the 18th century progressed, the competition to build violas didn't just shrink, it practically evaporated.
The numbers in the text are shocking. Let's look at the titans of the 18th century. Joseph Guarneri del Cusu, whose violins are played by Heifetz and Stern. He made absolutely zero violas. Carlo Bergonzi, one of Stradivari's greatest successors, zero.
Even outside of Cremona, the market was barren. In Rome, you had David Tekler, a phenomenal maker. The Hill brothers inspected a viola Tekler made in 1730, and on the margin of his internal label, Tekler had handwritten a note in Italian, La terza viola, the third viola. In 40 years of being a master luthier in a major European capital, he would receive commissions for exactly 3 violas.
Wow. In Venice, you had Domenico Montagnana, who made some of the most highly prized cellos in existence. How many violas? 3. It is a completely dead market. But there is one major exception. A luthier who managed to navigate this dark age and leave a lasting mark. Johannes Baptiste Guadagnini.
J.B. Guadagnini is a fascinating outlier. He did not stay in one city like the Cremonese makers. He was highly nomadic. Throughout his career, he operated workshops in Piacenza, Milano, Cremona, Parma, and finally settled in Turin. And because he traveled, he tapped into slightly different micro-markets. Across all those decades, he managed to construct 9 known violas.
9 is essentially mass production compared to Tekler. And Riley's text hones in on one very specific, beautiful example of his work, the 1781 Ex Villa Guadagnini, built during his late Turin period, and famously played by the American violist Bernard Zaslav of the Fine Arts String Quartet.
And the Zaslav Guadagnini is the perfect instrument to trigger what is arguably the most fiercely debated topic in the entire viola community.
Yes. I'm going to step out of my role as host for a second and speak directly on behalf of every single violist listening to this deep dive right now. Violists are pathologically obsessed with size. It is a deeply ingrained cultural belief in the community. Your teacher tells you, your peers tell you, if you want a true viola sound, if you want a C string that can roar over a symphony orchestra, you need a massive sound box. You need a 16.5-inch or a 17-inch instrument. The logic is simple. A lower frequency requires a larger vibrating air mass to project. Bigger box, bigger sound. Are you trying to tell me, based on this historical record, that this deeply held belief is a myth?
I am telling you that acoustic physics and historical evidence completely dismantle that belief. And the Zaslav Guadagnini is Exhibit A. Let's look at the raw dimensions of this legendary concert-class instrument. The body length is 40.16 centimeters. That translates to 15 and 1,316 inches.
Wait, that is undeniably small. That is almost a full half-inch shorter than the 16.25-inch models that Andrea Guarneri standardized. In the modern conservatory world, a 15-inch viola is often treated as a student size, or something you give to a violinist who wants to dabble.
Exactly. By modern prejudices, it's a diminutive instrument. Yet, as Riley's text explicitly notes, the tonal quality of this specific 15-inch Guadagnini is astonishing. Everyone who has heard Zaslav play it attests to its massive, resonant, commanding tone in all registers, including the notoriously difficult low C string.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this. How is that physically possible? If we agree that low frequencies need to move more air, how does a 15-inch soundbox project a low C just as powerfully as a 17-inch tenor? Does physics just give a free pass to the instrument because the varnish is pretty?
It's not a free pass. It is a masterclass in acoustic engineering. Zaslav himself contends, and modern acoustic analysis supports him, that sheer body length is not the determining factor in tonal sonority. It is about holistic design and efficiency. Think of it this way. Having a massive speaker cone doesn't guarantee a great bass sound if the magnet is weak and the enclosure is poorly designed. A beautifully engineered, smaller speaker will easily outperform it.
So it's about how efficiently the wood is interacting with the air cavity rather than just the raw size of the cavity itself.
Precisely. Guadagnini understood that if you were going to reduce the air volume by making the instrument shorter, you have to optimize everything else to compensate. It starts with the highly specific selection of wood. He chose wood with the perfect stiffness-to-weight ratio. Then, it is about the minute internal architectural detail.
You're talking about plate tuning and thickness graduation.
Yes. A master luthier meticulously carves the inside of the top and bottom plates, leaving them thicker in the center and microscopically thinner near the edges. This creates a flexible diaphragm effect. If you carve a small plate perfectly, it will flex and pump air far more efficiently than a large, clumsily carved plate.
So the 15-inch Guadagnini is acting like a highly tuned acoustic pump.
Exactly. Combine that perfect graduation with the specific mathematical arching of the belly, the exact tension and placement of the internal bass bar, the location of the sound post, and the formulation of the varnish that hardens the outer fibers. All of these factors synthesize. A smaller, stiffer backplate can project low frequencies brilliantly if the overtones are aligned correctly. The rich, booming sound of Zaslav's Guadagnini completely substantiates the theory that design triumphs over raw dimensions.
This cannot be overstated for the modern players listening. How many violists do you know in your studio or in your orchestra who are suffering from chronic neck pain, rotator cuff tendonitis, or carpal tunnel because they are wrestling with a massive, unwieldy 17-inch instrument, and they refuse to downsize because they are terrified of losing their big sound?
It is a tragic epidemic in the viola world. Players are physically destroying their bodies for the sake of an acoustic myth.
The historical evidence of these Italian masterpieces proves definitively that you do not need a giant piece of lumber to produce a world-class resonant tone. You need a brilliant luthier. You need efficient acoustic design. It is incredibly validating for anyone considering downsizing their instrument to save their shoulders.
But we can't fully understand the physical evolution of the viola without understanding the musical forces that finally dragged it out of this dark age. We need to look at how the viola ultimately found its permanent voice. We need to look at orchestration and the unstoppable rise of opera.
To understand the viola's resurrection, we actually have to rewind the clock back to the very end of the 16th century, right before the Dark Age set in. We need to look at the first time a composer actually respected the viola enough to give it a specific, named part in a published ensemble work.
We are looking at the year 1597 and a composer named Giovanni Gabrieli. He published a monumental collection called Sacre Sinfonia, and within that collection is a piece called Sonata Pianoforte.
Gustav Reis, the great musicologist, notes this piece is historically groundbreaking for two reasons. First, it is one of the earliest known pieces to explicitly print dynamic markings piano, meaning soft, and forte, meaning loud directly on the page. But secondly, it is among the earliest to designate precise, mandatory instrumentation for the players,
which was incredibly rare. Prior to this, composers essentially wrote melodic lines and expected you to play them on whatever instruments you happen to own. Here is the treble line, play it on a violin or a flute or a shawm, whatever you have. But Gabrieli was highly specific. He divides the ensemble into two spatially separated choruses, or choros.
And the orchestration of these choruses is what I want to zero in on. Chorapeut is orchestrated for a cornetto, a wooden treble instrument, and 3 trombones. Choratissus is orchestrated for 1 violino and 3 trombones.
Now, we need to clarify that in 1597 Venice, the word violino did not mean the small soprano violin we know today. David Boyden and other scholars have proved definitively, based on the fact that the written range of the part descends explicitly down to the open, low C string, that violino was a Venetian term for the viola.
Okay, but look at the acoustic math of Coro II. You have 1 single string instrument, 1 viola playing against a wall of 3 brass trombones. How on earth does that make any sense? If you put a single violist in front of 3 modern trombone players and ask them to play together, the viola gets completely, instantly obliterated. It would be a sonic massacre.
It sounds completely absurd to modern ears because we are projecting 21st century acoustic properties onto 16th century instruments. The instruments Gabrieli was composing for were fundamentally different beasts. The trombones of his era were called sackbuts.
Sackbuts, which is just a fantastic word to say. But how is a sackbut different from a modern Yamaha trombone?
It comes down to the bore size and the bell flare. A modern trombone has a wide cylindrical bore and a massive flared brass bell. It is designed to act as an acoustic megaphone, projecting a blaring, strident tone to the back of a 3,000-seat concert hall. A 16th century sackbut had a much narrower bore and a very small, gently flaring bell. It did not blare. It had a soft, mellow, almost vocal quality. It was specifically designed to accompany and blend with human voices in delicate church choirs.
Furthermore, we have to factor in the venue Gabrieli was writing for.
Absolutely. Gabrieli was the principal organist at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice.
The acoustics in St. Mark's are legendary. It is a massive, cavernous stone space with extreme reverberation. Gabrieli utilized polychoral writing, meaning he physically placed coro dome in one loft high up in the cathedral and chorus the second in another loft across the room. The sound would bounce and swirl in the stone dome.
And as Boyden contended, when Gabrieli wrote that violino part, he fully intended for it to be played on one of those massive 17 or 18-inch tenor violas we talked about earlier. He might have even had multiple players doubling the line. A massively resonant tenor viola playing in a highly reverberant stone cathedral, balancing against soft, narrow-bore sackbuts. It suddenly isn't an acoustic mismatch at all. It was a perfectly balanced, rich blending of timbres.
So in 1597, the viola has a prominent named voice. But as we know, the Dark Age descended shortly after, and the viola lost that independence. By the time we hit the high Baroque era of Corelli and Vivaldi, the Concerto Grosso is the dominant orchestral form, and the viola is treated appallingly.
In the Concerto Grosso format, composers created drama by contrasting a small group of elite soloists, the concertante, usually 2 violins and a cello, against a larger, simpler string orchestra, known as the ripieno.
And the viola was strictly, exclusively relegated to the ripieno. It was orchestral filler.
It was acoustic glue. If you look at a Vivaldi concerto, the viola part is often incredibly tedious. The composer used it merely to double the bass line an octave higher for extra volume, or to awkwardly chug along, playing the middle notes of a chord on the offbeats. It had zero independent melodic life. It required very little skill to play.
Which is why Pietro Locatelli is a hero to violists everywhere. Riley points to Locatelli's Christmas Concerto, published in 1721, as a massive seismic breakthrough for the instrument.
Locatelli did something that was considered highly radical for the time. He looked at the viola section, which had been treated as a single, blunt instrument for decades, and he scored it with independent, complex, musically interesting lines. More importantly, he split the section. He wrote for viola the first and viola second.
He brought back the density, but he didn't just do it in the loud, full orchestra tutti sections. He actually gave the violas four-part independence in the delicate, exposed solo concertante sections alongside the star violins.
The text highlights the second movement of the concerto, the grave, as a prime example. Locatelli completely breaks away from that tedious, filling-in ripieno material. The violas are weaving independent polyphony. They are driving the emotional narrative of the music. It proved that the viola could still be a sophisticated, expressive voice if the composer simply bothered to write for it.
It was a vital creative spark. But let's be honest, a few innovative concertos by Locatelli weren't enough to permanently drag the viola out of the Dark Age and sustain an entire industry of luthiers. What finally cemented the viola's permanent, unshakable place in the musical ecosystem was a change in venue, driven by a new, highly lucrative entertainment industry.
You're talking about the rise of Italian opera.
Opera changed everything. It started in Florence, right at the end of the 16th century, championed by the Florentine Camerata. They staged early works like Daphne and Eurydice, attempting to recreate the sung drama of ancient Greek tragedy. And it was a hit. It was an immediate, wildly enthusiastic success. It spread like an absolute wildfire across Italy to Mantua, Rome, Venice.
But the crucial historical pivot isn't just the music itself. It is where the music was being performed. Initially, secular music was largely confined to private, aristocratic salons. These were relatively small, intimate rooms, often heavily tapestried, attended by a small group of quiet nobles.
But opera became a public spectacle. It moved out of the private salons and into massive, purpose-built public theaters. And these theaters were noisy. You had large crowds eating, talking, and shouting. You had actors and singers belting out arias on a raised stage.
And that massive shift in the acoustic environment forced a brutal Darwinian evolution upon the orchestra pit.
Right. In a quiet tapestried salon, you could play a lute or a recorder or a delicate six-string viol. The viols had flat backs, low string tension, and a very soft, breathy, intimate tone. They were beautiful, but they were quiet.
But if you put a consort of viols into a raucous 1,000-seat public opera house, they are instantly entirely swallowed by the ambient noise. They physically cannot project enough sound waves to reach the back row, let alone accompany a powerful opera singer. They became acoustically obsolete overnight.
The composers and theater directors desperately needed instruments that possessed raw projection, volume, and dramatic cutting power.
And the violin family, the violins, the cellos, and yes, the violas had exactly the acoustic architecture required. Unlike the viols, the violin family utilized highly arched carved backs, much higher string tension, and a sound post that efficiently coupled the top and back plates. They didn't just vibrate, they projected sound forward like a parabolic mirror.
The violin family had the teeth that the theater demanded. They rapidly, completely replaced the lutes and viols, becoming the permanent, indispensable nucleus of the opera orchestra.
And the viola was the vital center of that nucleus. The opera composers realized that if they wanted to create a massive wall of sound to support a dramatic aria, they needed the middle register to be thick and resonant. The viola, especially those mid-sized, highly efficient 16-inch instruments that Andrea Guarneri had pioneered and that Guadagnini later perfected, answered the call flawlessly. It provided the acoustic engine of the orchestra, it secured the violist's jobs permanently, and in doing so, it guaranteed the physical survival of the instrument itself.
It was the crucible that forged the modern string section as we know it. So we have covered an immense amount of historical and acoustic ground today. We have seen how a simple, seemingly innocent shift in musical harmony from 5 parts to 4, combined with the absolute dominance of the Trio Sonata, almost entirely erased the viola from the 17th century musical landscape.
We saw how the great master luthiers of Cremona, facing a completely dead market and recovering from a devastating plague, were forced to adapt. Makers like Andrea Guarneri innovated the highly efficient, ergonomic 16 1/4-inch design, while Antonio Stradivari produced a vanishingly small handful of massive, breathtaking tenors that are now literally worth more than their weight in gold dust.
We tackled the persistent, physically damaging myth of size versus sound, proving through Guadagnini's brilliant 15-inch models and the physics of plate tuning that luthier design and efficiency triumph over sheer lumber every time. And finally, we traced how the sheer acoustic demands of massive public opera houses forced composers to rely on the projective power of the arched-back viola, permanently securing its chair in the center of the modern orchestra.
It is a history defined by severe bottlenecks, periods of near extinction, and miraculous, mathematically brilliant adaptations.
Which brings it all back to you, the listener, to the students and performers of Viola Studio. Every single time you open your case, rosining your bow, and pick up your viola, you are holding the physical manifestation of this intense, centuries-long struggle. The dimensions of the wood under your hand, the shape of the arching, the repertoire on your music stand, it was all forged by the bubonic plague of 1630, by the changing tastes of Baroque chamber music, and by the sheer, raw acoustic demands of the Italian opera theater.
It is an incredibly profound, heavy legacy to carry under your chin.
So what does this all mean for us today? We always like to end our deep dives by stepping away from the established facts and giving you something provocative to chew on, a new way to look at the history we just unpacked.
I want to leave you with a hypothetical, a massive what-if of musical history. We spent a lot of time discussing how Arcangelo Corelli and his contemporaries locked the viola out of the Trio Sonata, utilizing 2 violins and a cello instead. But what if they hadn't? What if the early Baroque composers had decided that the Trio Sonata sounded better with 1 violin, 1 viola, and 1 cello?
Oh, wow. If they had done that, they would have essentially created the modern string quartet structure, 2 treble, 1 alto, 1 bass, a full century before Joseph Haydn is credited with inventing it.
Exactly. And if the viola had been a mandatory starring instrument in the most popular chamber music format of the 1680s, how would the physical design of the instrument have evolved differently to keep up with the violins?
That is a staggering thought. If the demand had been there, would Stradivari have made 600 violas instead of 18?
Probably. Would those giant 18-inch tenors have survived longer because their massive bass resonance was required to fill out the chamber ensemble? Or conversely, would the standardization of the comfortable 16-inch model we play today have been perfected and universally adopted a century earlier, saving generations of players from physical strain?
100 years of lost chamber music masterpieces and a completely different evolutionary tree for the instrument. It is a haunting thought to end on, but a beautiful reminder of how fragile musical history really is. It's something to deeply consider the next time you sit down in the practice room to work on your Bach suites or your orchestral excerpts. The instrument in your hands is a survivor. Keep practicing, keep analyzing the acoustics, and keep questioning the history of the wood under your chin. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope this summary and analysis have been of great help to you. Please remember that this is only a summary and can never replace the book itself. Therefore, we invite you to truly immerse yourself in the work by reading the original text. If this content was useful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Remember, you can share this video with your friends to help our community continue to grow. Warmest regards, and remember, there is always time to learn and explore the world of classical music. A Viola Studio production.